Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Let's continue with the High Elves project and paint this mage from the old Island of Blood set. Since this is a hero for the army, I'd like to spend a little more time on it. So let's grab our brushes and get started. I'm going to paint the cape separately. It'll be too difficult to access most of the model if I paint it fully assembled. I mounted the pieces on corks so they would be easier to handle. Then I undercoated them with white primer. I began by painting the skin with an equal parts mix of contrast medium and Darkoath flesh. Apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses, and then use the brush to soak up any excess. After the first layer dried, I painted a second. I find that I get much smoother results by applying 2 diluted layers rather than 1 layer at full strength. Next I painted the hair with Skeleton Horde. Followed by a thin layer of Caledor yellow. I painted the white next, using a mix of about 4 parts contrast medium to 1 part Stormvermin fur. I developed this mix for my High Elves because I wanted the white to have a neutral gray shade, rather than using a warm color like Skeleton Horde or a cool color like Apothecary White. You could use either of those colors instead if you don't feel like mixing anything. Paint this layer just like any other contrast paint. Apply plenty of paint so it flows into the recesses, and then use the brush to soak up any excess. I want a really bright, smooth white, and it's important to make the paint as smooth as possible. The smoother it is now, the less touch-up work I'll have to do later. I really liked painting the dark bluish-gray cape on my Shadow Warriors, and I want to try to incorporate that color in the rest of the army. So I decided to paint the Mage's cape the same way, and it starts with a mix of equal parts Basilicanum gray and Ultramarines blue. Pay special attention to excess paint, and use the brush to soak it up. On large surfaces like capes, the paint tends to keep pooling and dripping down, so you may need to go back a couple times and soak up excess paint. The color looks streaky and uneven with just 1 layer, so I painted a second for an even finish. Next I base coated the leather areas with Wyldwood. After the first layer dried, I diluted the paint with an equal amount of water and applied a thin glaze to even out the finish. The mage is standing on some kind of fiery magic spell, and I'd like to paint it with some warm tones to complement all the blues on the model. I started off by painting it with a layer of Caledor yellow. If you made any mistakes with any of the other colors earlier, just touch it up with white paint first. I'd like to build up the depth some more and blend some deeper yellows and oranges into the flames, beginning with Iyanden yellow. I'm using an older number 2 brush for this step because it can hold a lot of paint and it has a blunt tip. Contrast paints are really easy to blend. Just apply paint to a small section, rinse the brush, and then use the clean brush to blend out the edges. Next I repeated the same process with Magmadroth Flame. This is a very strong color compared to the yellow, so I added it in smaller amounts. Then I rinsed the brush and blended out the edges. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Let's leave the flames for now and base coat the staff with Skeleton Horde. I'm not too worried if some paint gets on the unpainted parts, since I'll be using opaque paint for those sections later. Before I paint the next areas, I'd like to paint a thin black outline around them. This is a technique often called blacklining, and it helps give the model extra definition. I prefer to paint the black lines after painting one area, but before painting the next. My biggest concern is making sure that the painted areas stay clean, so I'm making sure that the line is neat and crisp on that side, and it usually involves leaning the brush onto the unpainted side. If any black paint spills over on the unpainted areas, that's fine, since I'll just base coat right over it anyway. With all the black lining applied, I base coated the metal areas with Iron Hand steel, and make sure to leave that thin black outline around each section. And after the first layer dried, I painted a second for an even finish. I shaded all the steel with Gryph-Charger gray. Contrast paints work great for shading metals, and Gryph-Charger gray has a bluish tone that I think really fits with the color scheme. Next, I base coated the rest of the cloth with Caledor Sky Blue. Just like with the silver base coat, leave a thin black outline around it. After the first layer dried, I painted a second for a smooth, even finish. Then I shaded the blue with Magos Purple. I really like the look of Magos Purple over a blue base coat. It doesn't end up looking purple after it dries, and it's not too dark. If you want a darker shade, I'd recommend Drakenhof Nightshade instead. Before I paint the gold, I'd like to add a black line around any areas that still need it. Basically wherever the gold meets up against the blue or silver. Then I base coated the gold with Retributor armor. I want the gold to be really smooth and reflective, so after the first layer dried, I painted a second. Then I shaded the gold all over with Skeleton Horde. I'd like the shadows to be a little darker, so I shaded one more time with Darkoath flesh. Rather than painting it all over, I tried to paint it directly into the recesses. Then I painted the gems black. At this stage you could assemble and base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to keep going and add some highlights. I started by painting the potion bottles, and I made separate short videos for each of those. You can check them out here, and I'll also put some links to those videos down in the description. Next I painted the teeth and eyes with white. I painted the eyes black earlier during the blacklining process. I like to paint the entire eye white and leave a thin black outline. Then I added the pupils with a small dot of black. I decided to add a highlight to the skin. You could skip this step if you want to, but I like to put a little more effort into characters. I mixed some white into Kislev flesh and painted a few highlights on the sharpest edges and corners. Next I highlighted the hair with Offwhite. Offwhite is a very strong paint, so I thinned it with water, and with barely any paint on my brush, I added a few transparent, glaze-like highlights. Let's highlight the white fabric next with glazes of gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. Thin the paint with water, and with barely any paint on your brush, apply thin layers to the raised edges and folds. Notice how quickly the paint dries, and how it doesn't flow or run off the brush. If the paint flows or runs, it means you have too much paint on the brush. Focus on smoothing out any rough areas from the base coat stage, and build several layers for a bright, even finish. This gray has to be my favorite color for painting bright white. It's so light, it functions as a white paint, but because it's slightly darker, you still have the option to highlight it later with pure white. Next I highlighted the edges of the fabric with pure white. If you want a more blended look, you could thin the paint with water and apply it as a series of glazes. I like the sharp look of edge highlights, so I painted a narrow line on most of the edges. Let's move on to the dark blue cape next, and I highlighted it with thin glazes of the Fang gray. Thin the paint with a lot of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, add a thin layer to the raised edges and folds. The paint should dry almost as soon as it leaves the brush. If it takes longer to dry, or if it runs and flows into the recesses, it means you have too much paint on your brush. Notice how the base coat is showing through, and the layer is transparent. Each layer you paint on top of that will increase the opacity. Build up a few layers, one on top of the other, and paint each one progressively closer to the sharpest point in the fold. Eventually, the paint will be completely opaque, or close to it, and you can add a final line highlight with undiluted paint. Another way to paint the highlights is to establish the sharpest edges with an opaque line highlight first, and then blend towards them with glazes. I like to use both methods. Generally, I'll do glazing first on the larger areas, and on smaller areas I'll start with the sharp line highlights. Next I added one more highlight with Russ Gray. You could paint it with glazes if you prefer a more blended look. I like finishing each section with a crisp edge highlight, so I won't blend this stage. Let's highlight the brighter blue next, with a couple glazes of Caledor sky. The Magos purple shade didn't darken the base coat too much, but this highlight will help establish the light sections and smooth out the surface, and the next highlights will look a lot better with this foundational highlight. Next I highlighted the edges of all the blue areas with an equal parts mix of Caledor sky and Lothern blue. I'd like to take the blue one step further, so I highlighted the sharpest edges and corners with Lothern blue. Next I highlighted the leather in 2 stages with Steel Legion Drab. First I thinned the paint with water and added a soft glaze to the boots and the sword hilt. Then I took some undiluted Steel Legion Drab and painted all the edges. Most of the time I'll skip the glazing process on the smaller details. I find they usually don't need it. The larger the area, the more likely it will benefit from a couple light glazes. If you make any mistakes, it's easy to touch up with Dryad Bark. Just mix in some Steel Legion Drab until it matches the background color. Moving on to the steel next, I painted a glaze of Iron Hand steel. Washes and shades tend to dull down metallic surfaces, and a glaze like this will restore the shine. I don't want to paint it everywhere though. I'm treating it like a highlight, and painting it where the light would be more likely to reflect. Then I painted all the edges of the steel with Stormhost silver. Next I highlighted the gold, in a similar manner to the steel. First I applied a glaze of Retributor armor on the raised edges, and anywhere I think the light would reflect the most. I mixed equal parts Retributor armor and Stormhost silver, and I picked out all the edges of the gold. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Liberator gold is a close match, but I prefer mixing it myself because I can adjust the color to whatever shade I need. Next I highlighted the staff with a few lines of Bonewhite. I think the staff details could use some more color to break up the gold, so I decided to paint these details with white and blue. First I painted each area with black. It doesn't have to be a solid coat, just enough for the recesses to have a solid black outline. These details are so small, we can get away with simplifying the colors a bit. I base coated the blue sections with Caledor sky, leaving a thin black outline. I skipped the shade and the mix highlight, and went straight to a Lothern blue highlight on the edges. For the white areas, I base coated with gray number 8, and then highlighted the edges with white. I'd like to smooth out the yellow and orange spell effect, and that's really easy to do with some glazes of Yriel yellow and Fire Dragon. You could paint these in any order you like, or go back and forth between the two. I concentrated the yellow glaze on the lighter sections, and gradually faded it into the orange. Then I glazed Fire Dragon over the orange sections. With the yellow and orange looking better, next I added some edge highlighting to the yellow sections with Toxic Yellow. I want the ends of the flames to be the brightest, so I started the brush stroke there, and as I worked my way down, I gradually eased up pressure on the brush. That way the line would slowly fade out into the orange. The last things to paint are the gems, and I don't think I've painted purple gems on the channel yet, so let's go with that. Over a black base coat, I painted the whole gem with Phoenician purple, leaving a thin black outline. You may want to paint a second layer for an even finish. Next I painted the bottom half of the gem with an equal parts mix of Phoenician purple and Genestealer purple. After the first layer dried, I painted a second layer in a slightly smaller crescent shape along the bottom. Then I painted an even smaller crescent shape with Genestealer purple. Next I painted a very narrow line along the bottom of the gem with a mix of Genestealer purple and white. Finally, I added a couple white reflective dots. I carefully assembled the model with superglue. Then I covered over the gaps on the base with small pieces of paper and wood glue. I brushed a generous amount of wood glue on the top of the base, and then sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with a layer of thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a heavy dry brush of Fang brown, Balor brown, and then Bonewhite. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded them with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base with Fang brown, and after that dried, I applied patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. I enjoyed spending a little more time on this model compared to the troops. And I like the way the darker cape fits in with the color scheme. I'm going to have to find a way to work that color into the rest of the army. What High Elf models would you like to see next? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.